Hello and welcome to the second week of the short story. We're going to be looking at our first set of writers, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Chesnutt, and Jack London. So let's start with our first writer, short story writer, Washington Irving. This is a photograph of his house where he spent the remaining years of his life, Sunnyside in Tarrytown, New York. Washington Irving, and here are his dates: 1783. He was born in New York City. He had a brief formal education, but was truly an avid reader. His father's library was quite extensive, so even though he didn't go to school, mostly he was self-educated. Although he studied to be a lawyer, he really was wanted to be a writer and is the first American to be recognized as a quote-unquote man of letters. He was a very prolific writer, writing histories, biographies, but he was also a satirist, as we will see. He introduced the American landscape, the American setting, and themes to the world, and was not a derivative necessarily of European writers, or at least he took the first steps into being a truly American writer. Um, and there's a lovely portrait of him as a younger man here. Now, his first works, very interesting to me in terms of their titles. For example, if we look at this first title, he used titles that were funny, they were often long, and sometimes he wrote with pseudonyms. So in his 1809 work, The History of New York, if you look at this title, it's probably one of the longest titles in all of American literature. A History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, etc., etc. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that he was a writer of this new country, and having to say, oh, well, this is not just make believe; it's a true history. Though again, this is kind of tongue in cheek. And you see, he's writing under the name of Dietrich Knickerbocker, an old Dutch name. In 1819, perhaps his most famous work was this sketchbook of this person who did not exist, Geoffrey Crayon, and he wrote this while he was abroad in England. And it's from the sketchbook that we get Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So moving along to Rip Van Winkle, one of his most famous works, his most famous short stories. So really this character of Rip Van Winkle has become a literary archetype, a kind of universal symbol for time that's been lost, for what would we say, the encroachment of change perhaps. We like him as a character. He's a good-natured guy. He just wants to hang out with the guys, and he wants to tell stories and relax. He's kind of the opposite of the Puritan work ethic. And what's interesting about this is that, yes, this is such an American tale. We've got the Dutch characters, we've got references to Henry Hudson, and so forth. But it is Washington Irving took a German folk tale and he set it in the New World, set it in America, in the Catskills, and we wind up with Rip Van Winkle. Note that his antagonist is his wife, Dame Van Winkle, who wants him to get up and get going and to be a hard worker, to be someone who provides for his family. And poor old Rip, he just doesn't want to do that. And his best friend is his dog. I've put an interesting quote here about Irving by a critic saying that perhaps Irving isn't that deep, that maybe, where he lacks what Hawthorne and Melville and later writers brought. So we can talk a little bit about him, about that aspect of Irving, whether or not he has a quote-unquote intellectual vitality and acuteness. And here's a wonderful painting of Rip Van Winkle coming down off the mountain, and notice the stars and the stripes appear in this right-hand corner. It's the American flag, and he slept through the Revolutionary War. All right, our next author is Edgar Allan Poe. who is truly, we would say he exerted, I would say, a substantial, a really deep influence on not just American authors, but also European authors. And I have this photograph of his cottage in the Bronx, and I put it there because I used to go by it every day to school when I was in grammar school, so I thought I would put it there. However, he was born in Boston and spent a lot of time in Richmond and is considered by some to be a kind of southern writer because of that. He died in Baltimore. His dates are 1809 to 1849, and he wrote about, I think somewhere I read, about 70 short stories, which to me is quite a lot. Many poems that he wrote, and he was such an interesting person in terms of literary criticism. He's one of our first critics, and somebody who really gave a lot of thought to what a short story, a good short story, what does an effective short story have? And he decided that, not in addition to being short and not a longer work, it had to have unity, and everything had to tie in together to create a dominant effect. So I think I've put something up on Blackboard I'd like you to look at, in terms of his theory of the short story, that everything needs to hang together as a unified effect to create a dominant impression. Interestingly, he's credited with someone who's wrote one of the first detective stories, series of detective stories, and Sir Conan Doyle based his Sherlock Holmes character on Poe's detectives. Of course, he's best known for his psychological pieces, the kind of gothic, grotesque pieces, and here are some very famous short stories. The Black Cat, where the narrator is very similar to the one in The Telltale Heart. He keeps insisting he's sane, but he does things like gouge out the eye of his cat and other awful things. So we kind of doubt his sanity. The Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick Usher and his twin sister Madeline. There's some suggestion of incest there. Poor Madeline is buried alive. Just all kinds of kind of grotesque and gothic things are going on. The Cast of Amontillado is a great story of revenge where the narrator is just obsessed with getting revenge on a man who has slighted him, and he winds up burying that man, Fortunato, alive in a wine cellar. And then we've got The Mask of the Red Death, which is an allegory and is about a rich man who has a feast, Prospero the prince, who has a feast and unwittingly invites the figure of death to his feast. And there's an ominous end to that story. The Telltale Heart is what we're going to be reading, one of the great narrators of American fiction. My goodness, he's an unreliable narrator telling us how sane he is. And of course, he probably isn't. I have linked you to this award winning animated short. And let me just take you through it. This is on Blackboard, but I thought I would just show you a little bit of it.
I think it was his eye. Yes, that eye. The eye. That. His eye staring. Milky white film. The eye. Everywhere. Everywhere in everything. Of course I had to get rid of the eye. So I waited. Watched. Waited. I was never so kind to the old man. I looked after him each minute, each second. And I waited. But night after night.
So, certainly this narrator is someone who is just absolutely creepy. Okay, our next short story writer is quite different, and Charles Chesnutt is one of my favorite short story writers. His dates are 1858 to 1932. We would say that Chesnutt really established a truly African American literary tradition, not only in the short story but also in the novel. And he was the first writer to make this kind of broad range of African American experience just part of the literary tradition. He wrote about middle class African Americans as well as ones at the lower end of the socioeconomic um, status. One of his themes in his realistic fiction, well, we'd say two of them, racism, of course, was very central, but also the color line. You know, if you look at this photograph of him, he was someone who was very light skinned. He could have passed for white, but he chose to embrace his African American heritage. And he was a realistic writer, though I would say with shades of romanticism. I will point out to you very quickly that he did write some work in dialect to capture the voices of former slaves. His character of Uncle Julius, I would like to point out, is very contrast with Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus. Disney made this character very racist way presented Uncle Remus, and Uncle Julius stands in stark contrast. He's a much more subversive character, and he told tales from Africa in this dialect. So if you get a chance, take a look at those stories. We will be looking at his Charles Chestnut's realistic fiction, The Wife of His Youth, The Sheriff's Children, and here are some illustrations from that set of short stories. I thought you would enjoy these. Our next writer and our final writer this week will be Jack London. He is somebody who lived the life a man's man, quote unquote, an adventurer. Traveled, was a sailor, explored the Yukon. For one winter, went up on, had got gold fever. He was someone who worked, did some blue collar work, was a writer, very much influenced by Darwin. He was a socialist. He really believed that people were trapped not only by their environment but by heredity, and that therefore, try as they might, they would find it very difficult to escape their environment, whether it be poverty or something that held them back. He's very famous, of course, for his northern tales and the landscapes he presents to us of America. The adventurer, he often writes about the person from down in the lower 48s who goes to the north and tries to conquer the natural world and fails. And in The Call of the Wild, perhaps his greatest novel, he writes one of the central characters, really a dog named Buck, who is able to survive the wilderness while the people around him cannot survive. And I have a little clip from a 1935 film version of The Call of the Wild. Just we'll end with this, and you can just take a quick look at this with Clark Gable and who else is in this? Uh, the actress says Loretta Young. So let me just pull this up. You see, there's Buck the dog.
Hear that? No. Gee, I wonder what it's going to be like having things instead of wishing for them.
Not nearly so much fun.
You're wrong, Claire. Wishing never got anybody anyplace. It's owning something that counts. And taking it when you can't get it any other way, that's all right, too. It's the law up here. The law of the Klondike. If there's something you need, grab it. Take it away from the other guy. It's a good law. It works.
Nope. They only work till you deserve to have what you take. Otherwise, they're stealing. Perhaps that particular commandment isn't respected up here.
They all get broken. That one gets splintered.